This is part 15, the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is a matter of great speculation when it comes to its meaning in terms of human thought and language. Now, some contend that the tower was built during a time when all of humanity was unified under the same goal of actualizing their divine nature with the help of a certain Sumerian deity. A deity who uncharacteristically favored humanity during an era when humanity was regarded by the gods as nothing more than livestock. The deity, known as Enki, gifted humanity with a certain understanding, a Promethean fire, as it were. This Sumerian deity, thought by some to have been part of an interplanetary race known as the Anunnaki, gave to mankind the very technology of the gods, or so the story goes. After learning of this gift, carelessly given to humanity, Enki's brother Enlil caused the languages of men to become many and fragmented, throwing the great and ambitious project of the Tower of Babel into chaos. The occult wisdom found in the Tower of Babel's story really has little to do with language and communication, or with a presumably jealous god, or even an interstellar being. The significance, in our lives at least, is that this story hints at the very nature of order and chaos itself. Or, in other words, the universal forces of creation and destruction. Specifically, how the dynamics of order and chaos, or creation and destruction if you like, how this dynamic operates within human psychology. Starting with the individual and scaling all the way up to the massive psychological implications that we find in modern global economic systems, for example. Okay? So the Tower of Babel symbolism demonstrates high-level knowledge of human nature, as it contains a warning for subsequent generations against runaway scale systems which go too far to one extreme. Extremes which emphasize the collective but destroy the identity of the individual, and vice versa. The tension which exists between order and chaos, or creation and destruction, is a preservation of balance, a balance between either extreme, otherwise known as the middle way. This is something in nature that is returned to, right? Extremes may come out, they may prevail for a time, and then the natural laws of the universe ultimately will seek balance and bring these extremes crashing to a halt in order to maintain this preservation or this natural order. So in an episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, Captain Jean-Luc Picard is taken hostage by the Borg, right? It's a great episode. If you haven't seen this, highly recommended. The Borg are a cybernetic race of organisms, and they're all linked together in a hive mind known as the collective. The individual is irrelevant in this Borg society, as all entities which comprise the collective forcibly co-opt the technology of the civilizations it absorbs in pursuit of its ultimate goal. That goal is to achieve perfection. This, of course, is an example of the system running away with itself to such an extreme that the individual is completely disregarded in order to achieve this goal. A goal, mind you, which is lacking in both intelligence and wisdom. In a very real sense, the story of the Borg in Star Trek is very similar to this building of the Tower of Babel. Because if you think about it, the story of the Tower of Babel doesn't really make a lot of sense on the surface. So you mean to tell me they're going to build this giant tower, that this huge structure that reaches to the heavens, and they're going to find their divinity, right? They're going to all work together and create this civilization where they can be gods themselves, right? This sounds like exactly what the Borg are trying to do. They're trying to achieve perfection, right? Now, the Borg are not only an example of losing one's identity, but of also risking the total loss of humanity by serving a system which is fueled by the sacrifices of individuality, or the assimilation of distinctive civilizations into a collective, right? Because the Borg is not only sacrificing individuals, but they're doing this on a very large scale, to entire civilizations. Entire civilizations are as these giant cube crafts type of things fly around the galaxy and the universe. They're gobbling up entire civilizations and absorbing them into their own, right? So what the Borg, nor any other megastructure type of system or civilization recognizes, however, is that despite how well organized and powerful a system appears to be, if its goal does not align with the natural laws of the universe, it will invariably destroy itself. Like I said, nature is a balance. We all know this intuitively. And anything that is unnature will tend towards the extremes, right? And extremes always destroy themselves. Although really, it is the forces of the universe at work simply restoring balance, right? It may appear that the systems are destroying themselves, right? But in actuality, what's happening is it is the natural forces, or natural law is restoring the balance. On the other extreme of the collective, we have the anarchist and the counterculturalist. This is where the individual is celebrated, and the man and his system are to be avoided, ridiculed, and ultimately dismantled. The concept of anarchy is often misinterpreted as simply chaos, right? Through the eyes of someone dependent on the system, but this simply isn't the case. However, in the view of the society from which we live today, anarchy might as well mean chaos when compared to the alternative. Anarchy actually means without external rulership. This implies self-regulation and independence, right? It's the idea of true freedom. If you want true freedom, right, you are going to have a whole lot more responsibility on your shoulders as a result, right? You can't, in a previous part in this Word Magic series, you can't outsource your self-interest to others, right? If you want true freedom, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. Of course, many whom are drawn to this idea self-identify themselves strongly as individuals and align themselves against the power structure. A power structure that does appear to assimilate the individual from a certain perspective. In a sense, it certainly does. And in another sense, creates the individual, and that's the paradox. They see these extremes of the system they live in, and I'm talking about the counterculturalist, or the anarchist. They will see these extremes of the system they live in and resist both the overt signals as well as the subliminal messages of conformity and belonging. They would rather fight against this threat to individuality than be like everybody else in the collective sense, right? We've all met these people. Some of us are in that stage of our lives. I've been in that stage of my life when I was younger. The whole punk rock thing and the anarchy thing appealed to me, And I think it's a natural stage as you become an adolescent and you want to individuate. You want to be separate from your parents, and you don't want to be like everybody else, right? So that some of this definitely comes from instinctual rejection of parents and authority figures from adolescence. And some of this, of course, is healthy and completely sane. It's completely normal. So here's a great example of this rejection of conformity and the celebration of the individual. And this comes from an Apple commercial that originally aired during the Super Bowl in 1984. This commercial was directed by Ridley Scott. Some of you may know his work. And this television advert depicts hordes of Borg light. When I say Borg light, I mean these guys in the commercial, they kind of resemble the Borg a little bit, but they don't have all of the apparatus attached to their face and body, right? It's a very interesting commercial. If you haven't seen it, just go on YouTube and check out Apple commercial 1984. It's really great. So these Borg-like or Borg-light office drones, they're basically IBM PC users and soon to be Windows users. And they're just sort of, in the commercial, they're just sort of shuffling around along in their miserable conformity. While the man, right, the man on the big screen issues his ideological mandates to the masses. And then we see this vibrant, youthful woman running into the heart of this oppressive system. And she hurls a sledgehammer at the big screen and smashes it into bits, sparking a computer revolution. The message here is signaling the triumph over the system by the individual, right? They're saying Apple computers are not for individuals. They're saying Apple computers are not for institutions, but Apple computers are for individuals. And you're an individual, right? You're not like everybody else, are you? Right? So that's a great commercial, and also the power of advertising and marketing is quite strong in that message there. The human desire to both belong and retain their individuality is a part of the strongest instinct in every animal on the planet, and that instinct is survival. At the end of this commercial, this is one of the best lines of any commercial. It says, on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. Some may argue today that we are definitely living in 1984. Now, we cannot survive without others. We cannot survive without the collective, right? Nor can we survive if we completely surrender our individuality. We lose our identity. We lose who we are, right? So this middle way, or this force of Lord Vishnu, the preserver, is what allows us to survive between the extremes of creation and destruction. Now, I choose to use the term Lord Vishnu, the preserver, in my understanding of the middle way and the dynamic between creation and destruction, right? That's how I express it, but it can be expressed in many, many ways, right? That's just how I choose to express it at this moment in time. But there's many different expressions that get the point across. So what then in any system, tribe, society, or civilization other than a collection of individuals, right? What is any system other than a collection of individuals? Systems exist simultaneously as idea, a goal, or a construct from a systematic perspective. And they're also, in reality, a collection of individuals, right? All these individuals with their own distinct preferences as different possibilities, all with their own motivations and desires, some aligning with each other, and some others not so much. Any organized human system is therefore, just like everything else in our reality, essentially a paradox, or in another sense, a unity of opposites, right? This unity of opposites creates a tension, creates this middle way, creates this preservation, right? So going even further, you, myself, all of us as individuals, we're not really individuals with our own language. We don't have our own individual language, our own thoughts, our own inspirations. Without first a family, a tribe, a society to teach you the constructs you need in order to declare yourself an individual in the first place, right? So there's a paradox happening. So a society or civilization as a whole is nothing at all without a collection of distinct individuals pursuing each their own self-interests and possessing their own desires and aspirations, right? So the Tower of Babel is a descriptor of what can happen to human systems which attempt to scale too far toward one extreme. After all, the building of the Tower of Babel was the most ambitious undertaking in the history of humanity at that time. So the goal, similar to the Borg, was to achieve perfection under an organized, monolithic, collective effort where all individuals were speaking the same language and all were working with the same exact goal in mind, or so they thought. Only that the legions of people who were working on this Tower of Babel, or an effort to reach the mind of God together, were not really working together at all. Or more accurately, they were working together for a time until the invariable human element of individuality versus the collective balance started to shift too far in one direction, and then naturally corrects the course as all things in nature invariably do. After all, there's no such thing as government in the subjective sense. No one person can be pointed at as being the government, right? You can't even point at the president as being the government, right? The president is first and foremost an individual like anybody else, right? But there's another hidden element buried deep inside this ancient story of the Tower of Babel. That element has to do with the conflation of the construct with the reality, or the confusion that occurs between knowledge and understanding. So this story of the Tower of Babel is trying to relay to us the importance of not confusing the map for the landscape. Now, this is a very difficult and slippery cognitive bias to to detect, where one understands a thing and believes that their giving of knowledge to another will translate to an equivalent understanding. Nothing could be further from the truth. And yet most people fall into this trap on a daily basis in one way or another. This is something I talked about in a previous part in this series where Aldous Huxley talks about the difference between knowledge and understanding. And this is so critical. This is so critical to understanding the real meaning behind the Tower of Babel. Here's a quote from the brilliant Ken Wilber, and he's talking about this. The ultimate metaphysical secret, if we dare state it so simply, is that there are no boundaries in the universe. Boundaries are illusions. Products not of reality, but of the way we map and edit reality. And while it is fine to map out the territory, it is fatal to confuse the two. This confusing the map for the territory, as Ken Wilber so elegantly puts it, I believe is the critical teaching in the Tower of Babel. Okay? And this idea of confusing the construct or confusing the words or the meanings, right? And this is what this presentation is all about. I'm essentially saying the same thing over and over and over, just in as many different ways as I can imagine to say it to get this point across, right? And the point is that there is an idea, there's a construct, there's something that is communicated, right? Either someone communicates it to you or you communicate it to someone else. That is just a map, okay? The words, the thinking, the thoughts, the ideas that you're expressing to others, right? Or the ideas that you even think of yourself, and then you map those on top of the actual reality, right? You can't confuse the two, right? Or at least, I would say 99% of the world is confusing knowledge and understanding and thinking they're the same thing. They're confusing the map with the landscape, right? This is so critical. This is one of the most critical things to understand in this entire series, is that yes, words have a certain power. Yes, words have undoubtedly a very, very distinct and important utility in our lives, but they're only the roadmap, right? These constructs are only the roadmap. The actual reality, the actual territory, right, is not the same as the map, as the descriptors. So the descriptors we use to talk about our reality, to convey ideas, are not a perfect one-for-one representation of the landscape or the reality, right? It's not a one-for-one relationship. And often people get lost in their language, lost in thought, lost in a certain reality, to the point that your reality that you're living in right now, you may not even, someone may not even own a computer and they could still live in a virtual reality in that sense, right? You can live in a virtual world of constructs, words, and ideas without hardly ever making contact with the territory, making contact with reality. You can live in this virtual world that's been created for you, right? And most people do. Most people go about their lives in a virtual sense, and it is very much like the Matrix, right? In that sense, it very much is like the Matrix. So that is the main teaching of the Tower of Babel. And this is the end of part 15. I did want to bring an example of someone who has made this recognition, the difference between the map and the territory. And this, of course, is Blastmaster KRS-One. Hip is the knowledge, and hop is the movement, right? I've heard KRS-One say that you cannot understand something until you become something, right? You can learn about it. It's kind of like that idea of you can learn about something in books, but until you experience it, you really don't know, right? But even in that experiencing of something, you could still in your mind be living in a virtual world where you're mapping out your experience with your thoughts, right? And you're letting all of the labels you put on everything stand between you and the raw experience or the actual territory, right? So that's what part 15 is all about. So that's the end of this part. I will see you guys next week for part 16.